The bankruptcy papers lay before Victor like a judge's final gavel, sentencing his life's work to oblivion. An uncontrollable tremor coursed through his hands, not born of mere fear. He'd long transcended that, but a primal resistance, a last-ditch rebellion from a body sensing its imminent self-destruction. 7 minutes. In 420 seconds, his impeccably dressed lawyer, Mr. Chin, would arrive, briefcase in hand, and the charade would be over. 3 decades of relentless building, about to crumble into dust with the stroke of a pen. But fate, it seemed, had a coffee-bearing messenger. A waitress named Deline was making her way towards his secluded table, a beacon of unexpected intervention in the sterile marble expanse. She carried with her a simple truth, a forward lifeline poised to yank him from the precipice. "You're making a mistake." The pen, a Mont Blanc his father had gifted him upon his first million, now a cruel irony, felt impossibly heavy, as if laden with the weight of 1,000 failures. Victor Hargrove, once a titan of industry, sat alone in the opulent lobby of what used to be his building. His gaze fixed on the damning documents spread across the polished surface like a morbid tapestry. Outside, the city was awakening, a symphony of car horns and hurried footsteps. But within these walls, time had stagnated, clinging to the agonizing present. 7:53 a.m. The clock seemed to mock him with its relentless march. 7 minutes until Richard's arrival. 7 minutes until he surrendered everything he'd poured his soul into for 30 years. His hand, drawn by an invisible force, reached for the pen, only to falter, suspended in midair. The tremor intensified, a physical manifestation of his inner turmoil. Not fear, he insisted inwardly. It was something far more insidious, a soul-deep weariness. Exhaustion, perhaps, or simply his body's desperate plea against its own demise. The vast lobby was deserted save for a lone cleaning cart tucked discreetly near the elevators and the ever-present waitress from the ground-floor cafe, diligently wiping down tables in the corner. He'd sensed her watchful gaze for the better part of 10 minutes, a subtle pressure on the back of his neck. Curiosity, he thought, or worse, pity. He despised the pity, that condescending shadow that had haunted him lately. He'd seen it in the eyes of his board members before their mass exodus, in his wife's tear-streaked face before she walked out the door, in his daughter's increasingly infrequent calls. Victor grasped the pen, the cold gold a stark contrast to his clammy skin. His father's Mont Blanc. How fitting that an instrument of such past triumph would now orchestrate his downfall. "Mr. Hargrove?" The voice, soft and hesitant, emanated from behind him. He remained motionless, unwilling to break the hypnotic spell of the papers before him. "I'm busy," he snapped, the word sharper than intended, though in truth he was doing nothing. He was simply frozen, a modern-day Sisyphus paralyzed at the foot of his insurmountable boulder. "I know. I'm sorry, but—" He could hear her drawing nearer, the quiet click of her sensible shoes against the marble floor, her approach measured and cautious, as if she were approaching a wounded, unpredictable animal. "I think you're making a mistake." That made him turn. She was younger than he'd initially perceived, likely in her late 20s, her brown hair neatly confined in a ponytail. A stained apron, a badge of her humble station, was tied securely around her waist. Her name tag read, Deline. The same look, the same cocktail of concern and something else resided in her eyes. Not pity, he noted with surprise, but genuine curiosity, perhaps even a hint of understanding. "Excuse me?" Victor's voice emerged harsher than he intended, a defensive reflex. Deline didn't flinch. She calmly set down her coffee pot on a nearby table, her gaze unwavering. "Those documents," she said, pointing to the bankruptcy papers. "I saw them earlier when I was cleaning. I wasn't trying to snoop, but the numbers, they don't look right." Victor almost laughed. "Almost. You're a waitress." "I am," she replied simply, her voice devoid of defensiveness. "But I used to work in accounting." She trailed off, a shadow passing over her face, a glimpse into a past trauma, something heavy and unspoken. Then, she straightened her shoulders, her gaze resolute. "Can I just look for a minute?" He should have refused. Should have told her to mind her own business, to return to her tables and her coffee pots, to the world of people whose lives still possessed a semblance of order. But something in her voice, a quiet, unshakable certainty, gave him pause. "Why do you care?" he asked, the question laced with a mixture of suspicion and desperation. Deline met his gaze, and for the first time that morning Victor felt truly seen. Not his failures, not his impending ruin, but him, the person buried beneath the weight of his crumbling empire. "Because I know what it's like to give up on something when maybe you don't have to," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "And I saw your face when you picked up that pen. You don't want to sign those papers." She was right. God help him, she was right. Victor slid the documents across the table, a silent offering of surrender and fragile hope. "You have 5 minutes. Then my lawyer gets here, and this all becomes official." Deline sat down opposite him, her movements quick and efficient as she pulled the papers closer. Her eyes darted across the pages, rapidly deciphering lines of numbers and legal jargon that had taken Victor's highly paid attorneys weeks to compile. He watched her face, scrutinizing her every expression, searching for any flicker of insincerity, any sign that this was simply a well-intentioned act of pity. But her expression remained focused, intense. She wasn't reading to be kind. She was genuinely looking, searching, understanding. Her finger stopped, hovering over a section near the middle of the 3rd page. "This debt consolidation calculation," she said, her brow furrowed. "They've counted your Riverside Holdings assets twice. Once here under commercial properties and again here under investment portfolios. That's $4. $2 million in duplicate liabilities." Victor leaned forward, his heart, which had been beating slow and heavy all morning, suddenly pounding with a renewed sense of urgency. "What? And this?" Deline flipped to another page, her finger pinpointing a specific paragraph. "This quarterly projection for your tech division. They're using last year's numbers, but didn't your software subsidiary just secure that contract with the hospital network? I saw it in the news last month. That would change your projected revenue by at least $3 million annually." "The contract," Victor finished, his mind racing, frantically piecing together fragments of information he'd been too emotionally drained to process. "The contract was finalized 6 weeks ago, but my CFO left before it was entered into the bankruptcy assessment." Deline nodded, her focus unwavering. She continued to read, her finger tracing the lines like a seasoned detective unraveling a complex case. "If these numbers are wrong, your debt-to-asset ratio is completely different. You might not even qualify for Chapter 11. You might just need restructuring." The word hit Victor like a jolt of electricity, jolting him from his stupor. Restructuring. Not bankruptcy. Not the end of everything. Just a different path. "Who are you?" he asked, the question emerging as an accusation, but laced with an undercurrent of desperate hope. He meant it as a prayer. Deline looked up from the papers, her eyes meeting his. For the first time, she smiled, small, sad, and achingly real. "Someone who made mistakes with numbers once and lost everything because of it. I don't want to watch someone else do the same thing if they don't have to." Victor opened his mouth to respond, but the lobby doors swung open with a dramatic flourish. His lawyer, Richard Chin, strode in, carrying his ubiquitous briefcase and wearing the same grim expression he'd sported for the past 2 months. Trailing behind him was someone Victor hadn't anticipated, someone whose presence sent a shard of ice through his already fragile composure. His ex-wife, Patricia, dressed in black as if attending a funeral, which, in a way, she was. "Victor," Richard said, his voice professional and carefully devoid of emotion. "It's time." Patricia remained silent, her gaze fixed on him, those cold, detached eyes that had once burned with passion, that had once looked at him as if he hung the moon. Now they regarded him as if he were already a ghost. Victor glanced back at Deline. She was gathering the papers, her movements quick and decisive. "Wait," Victor said, his voice firm. He stood up, And for the first time in months, he felt something other than despair. He felt possibility. "Richard, I need you to review these documents again. I think there are errors in the asset assessment." Richard frowned, his carefully constructed facade of composure cracking. "Victor, we've been over this a dozen times. Then we'll go over it a 13th time." Victor's voice was stronger now, resonating with a newfound conviction. Not the voice of a man on the verge of self-destruction, but the voice of a man who had just remembered how to fight. "There are duplicate entries and outdated projections. I'm not signing anything until we verify every number." Patricia laughed, a sharp, brittle sound that echoed through the lobby. "You're stalling. This is pathetic, Victor. Just sign the papers and let us all move on." But Victor wasn't looking at her anymore. His gaze was fixed on Deline, who had risen from the table and was slowly backing away, as if she had accomplished her mission and didn't want to intrude further. "Thank you," Victor said to her, his voice filled with genuine gratitude. Deline nodded once, a subtle acknowledgement, then turned towards the cafe. But Richard's voice stopped her in her tracks. "Wait, miss, what's your name?" "Deline," she said quietly, barely audible. Richard looked from Victor to the papers on the table, then back to Deline, his keen legal mind already calculating the implications of her presence. "Did you find these errors?" She hesitated, her gaze flickering downwards, then nodded. Richard Chin was a lot of things, but he wasn't stupid. He strode over to the table and picked up the documents, his eyes scanning the pages Deline had marked. His expression changed almost imperceptibly, but it was enough for Victor to notice. "Where did you work before?" Richard asked Deline, his tone now laced with professional curiosity. "Carter and Associates," she replied. "I was a junior accountant for 3 years." She paused, the shadow returning to her face, a fleeting glimpse of a painful past. "Before, I made a mistake that cost the firm a client. I was let go. Haven't been able to get hired in accounting since." Richard studied her for a long moment, his gaze probing, assessing. Then he turned to Victor. "She's right. These numbers need to be rechecked. If what she's pointing out is accurate, this whole filing could be premature." Patricia made a sound of disgust, a disdainful snort that punctuated the tense silence. "This is ridiculous. You're listening to a waitress over your own legal team?" "I'm listening to someone who actually looked at the numbers instead of just processing paperwork." Victor shot back, his voice regaining its old authority. He felt alive again, the blood pumping through his veins with a newfound vigor. Angry, perhaps, but undeniably alive. "Richard, I want a full audit of these documents today before anything gets filed." Richard nodded slowly, his professional mask firmly back in place. "I'll make the calls." "But Victor," Patricia interjected, her voice laced with venom, "if this doesn't pan out, then I'll sign the papers this afternoon." Victor finished, his gaze unwavering. "But I'm not signing them now. Not until I know for certain." Patricia grabbed her purse and stormed towards the door, her heels clicking sharply against the marble floor. "You're delusional, both of you." She didn't look back. The lobby fell silent after her departure, the air thick with unspoken tension. Richard gathered the documents, promising to have answers by noon, then disappeared into the elevators, leaving Victor alone with his unexpected savior. And then it was just Victor and Deline again, standing in the vast, empty lobby while the morning light streamed through the windows, illuminating the battlefield of his shattered life. "I don't know how to thank you," Victor said, the words inadequate to express the depth of his gratitude. Deline shook her head, her gaze averted. "Don't thank me yet. I might be wrong." "You're not wrong," Victor insisted, his voice filled with conviction. He didn't know how he knew, but he did. He felt it in his bones, a visceral certainty that transcended logic. "Why did you help me?" Deline looked down at her hands, rough and calloused from years of relentless work. Hands that should have been holding calculators and spreadsheets instead of coffee pots and dish rags. "Because someone should have checked my work before I submitted it," she confessed, her voice barely audible. Someone should have caught my mistake before it ruined everything. No one did. So, I guess I wanted to be that person for someone else. Victor felt something crack open in his chest, something that had been closed for a very long time. A dam of pent-up emotions, finally giving way. What was your mistake? He asked quietly, his voice filled with empathy. Deline offered a weak smile, but it didn't reach her eyes, a subtle betray of the pain that still lingered beneath the surface. I trusted the wrong person with the right numbers. And when everything fell apart, I was the one left holding the blame. She picked up her coffee pot and started walking back towards the cafe. Her shoulders slumped with a familiar weariness. But Victor called after her, his voice resonating with newfound purpose. Deline, if this works, if you're right about those numbers, I'm gonna need someone I can trust to help me rebuild. Someone who actually pays attention. She stopped walking but didn't turn around, her back to him, a silent question mark hanging in the air. I serve coffee now, Mr. Hargrove. That's all I'm qualified for. That's not true, Victor countered, his voice ringing with conviction. And I think you know it. Deline stood there for a moment longer, her back still to him, a battle raging within her. Then, without another word, she walked away, disappearing into the cafe like she'd never been there at all, leaving Victor alone with his rekindled hope. Victor sat back down at the table, the weight of the past months lifting ever so slightly from his shoulders. The pen was still there, waiting, a symbol of his potential destruction. But he didn't pick it up. Instead, he pulled out his phone and started making calls to his accountant, to his remaining board members, to anyone who might be able to verify what Deline had found. Because for the first time in months, Victor Hargrove had something he thought he'd lost forever. He had hope. By noon, the lobby had transformed into a scene of controlled chaos, a hive of activity that Victor barely recognized. His conference room on the third floor was packed with people, buzzing with nervous energy. Richard Chin, looking harried and stressed, was present, along with two forensic accountants Richard had called in, specialists known for their meticulous attention to detail. Victor's former CFO, a man named Davies, had reluctantly agreed to return for one day to review the files, his presence a testament to the severity of the situation. And, standing slightly apart from the throng of suits, was Deline, the unlikely catalyst of this dramatic turnaround. Richard had insisted on her presence, recognizing that she was the key to unlocking the truth hidden within the labyrinthine documents. She had changed out of her stained apron and was now wearing simple black pants and a crisp white blouse, clothes she likely kept in her locker for emergencies. She looked visibly uncomfortable, surrounded by all these high-powered professionals in their expensive suits, a stark contrast to her humble attire and unassuming demeanor. But when Richard asked her to explain her findings, her voice was steady and clear, her confidence growing with each point she made. The Riverside Holdings properties were listed twice because they fall under two different legal entities that share partial ownership, Deline explained, her finger pointing to the relevant sections of the documents projected on the large screen. But the bankruptcy filing treated them as separate assets with separate debt loads. In reality, the debt is shared and should only be counted once. That's $2 million in duplicate liabilities that don't actually exist. One of the forensic accountants, a woman named Susan with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense attitude, leaned forward, her gaze intense. That's a significant oversight. How did this get past the initial review? Richard shifted uncomfortably, his carefully constructed facade of professional competence beginning to crumble. The paperwork came from 3 different law firms handling various aspects of Victor's holdings. No one cross-checked between entities. Someone should have, Susan said flatly, her tone leaving no room for argument. She turned her attention back to Deline. What else did you find? Deline proceeded to walk them through 5 more critical errors, some smaller, some of substantial magnitude. Revenue projections that used outdated data, ignoring the recent hospital network contract. Asset valuations that didn't account for recent appraisals. A pension fund liability that had actually been resolved 2 months ago but was still listed as outstanding, further inflating the company's apparent debt. By the time she finished her presentation, The room was silent, the air thick with tension and unspoken accusations. Susan, the forensic accountant, broke the silence with a sharp, decisive statement. These documents aren't just wrong, they're dangerously wrong. If Victor had signed this morning, he would have declared bankruptcy while still being functionally solvent. That would have triggered asset seizures, credit destruction, and legal complications that would take years to untangle. Victor felt his stomach drop, the full weight of his near catastrophe crashing down upon him. He'd been 7 minutes away from utter destruction, from obliterating everything he'd worked for, all based on faulty information. "So what now?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Susan closed her laptop with a snap, her expression resolute. "Now you withdraw the bankruptcy filing, restructure your debt properly, and probably sue whoever prepared these documents for malpractice." Richard winced, his face paling. "That would be my firm." "Then I'd suggest you make this right," Susan said, her voice devoid of sympathy. She stood up, shook Victor's hand, and left the room without another word, leaving a wake of stunned silence in her wake. The room slowly emptied as people dispersed, leaving Victor to grapple with the enormity of what had just transpired. Finally, it was just Victor, Richard, and Deline, the three figures at the center of this unfolding drama. Richard looked like he'd aged 10 years in the past 4 hours, his shoulders slumped with defeat, his eyes filled with remorse. "I'm sorry, Victor," he said quietly, his voice barely audible. "This should never have happened. I trusted my associates to do their jobs, and they failed. I failed you." Victor should have been furious. Part of him was, but mostly he just felt tired. The adrenaline that had been fueling him all morning was beginning to wane, leaving him with a bone-deep exhaustion. "Get me a new proposal," he said, his voice flat. "Accurate this time. I want it by the end of the week." Richard nodded numbly, gathering his scattered belongings. Before he left, he turned to Deline, a flicker of genuine respect in his eyes. "If you ever want to get back into accounting, let me know. I could use someone on my team who actually reads what they're reviewing." Deline gave him a small, polite smile but didn't respond, her expression unreadable. Richard left the room, leaving Victor and Deline alone once more. "You saved my life today," Victor said, his voice filled with sincere gratitude. Deline shook her head, her gaze averted. "I just read some paperwork." "You did more than that," Victor insisted, his voice filled with conviction. He sank heavily into one of the conference room chairs, the enormity of the situation finally sinking in. "You gave me a reason to fight when I'd already given up. Do you know how rare that is?" Deline sat down across from him, her posture stiff and hesitant. She looked different in this setting, out of place yet strangely powerful. Professional, capable, like she belonged here more than she belonged behind a cafe counter. "Why did you give up?" she asked, her voice soft and questioning. "From what I saw in those documents, your company was struggling, but it wasn't dead. People don't usually file for bankruptcy when there's still a chance." Victor laughed, but the sound was hollow, devoid of humor. "Because everyone told me it was over. My board, my lawyers, my wife. After a while, you start to believe them. You start to think maybe they see something you don't. Maybe you're the only one too stubborn or too stupid to accept reality. Or maybe they were all too close to see clearly." Deline countered, her voice thoughtful. "Is that what happened to you?" Victor asked, his gaze probing. "Is that why you lost your job?" Deline was quiet for a long moment, her gaze fixed on some distant point beyond the windows. Outside, the city hummed with the sounds of traffic and voices, a symphony of life continuing on as if nothing had changed. But in here, in this sterile conference room, something had changed. Something fundamental. "I was working on a major account," Deline said finally, her voice barely a whisper. "Huge client. My boss gave me numbers to input into the quarterly report, and I trusted him. I didn't double-check his math because he was my supervisor, and I thought he knew what he was doing. Turns out he'd been skimming money from the client for months and was using me to hide it in the paperwork. When the client found out, my boss blamed me, said I'd made the errors. I was fired. He kept his job for another 6 months before they finally caught him. Victor felt a surge of anger rise in his chest. Not at Deline, but for her. For the injustice she had suffered. "Did you fight it?" "I tried," she said, her voice tinged with bitterness. "But I was 24 and he was a senior partner. No one believed me. After that, I couldn't get hired anywhere in accounting. Every application I sent out came back rejected. So, I took the first job I could find that would pay my rent." She gestured at herself, her eyes filled with a quiet resignation. "And here I am, serving coffee and wiping tables." "That's not where you belong," Victor said, his voice firm and resolute. "Maybe not," Deline conceded, her gaze averted. "But it's where I ended up. And honestly, I made peace with it. I thought maybe I wasn't cut out for that world anyway. Maybe I wasn't smart enough or tough enough or whatever it takes to survive in a place like that." "You were smart enough to catch errors that 3 law firms and a team of accountants missed," Victor countered, his voice unwavering. "You were tough enough to speak up, even though you had no reason to get involved. And you were brave enough to walk into a situation where you could have been embarrassed or dismissed, and you did it anyway because you thought it was right." Deline looked at him, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. She blinked them away quickly, attempting to regain her composure. "I'm offering you a job," Victor said, his voice clear and resolute. "My company needs someone who can audit financial documents and catch problems before they become disasters. Someone I can trust to tell me the truth, even when it's not what I want to hear. I think you're that person." Deline shook her head, her expression a mixture of disbelief and apprehension. "Mr. Hargrove." "Victor," he interrupted gently. "Victor," she said softly, testing the sound of his name on her lips. "I appreciate the offer. I really do. But I haven't worked in accounting in 3 years. I don't have current certifications. I don't have references. And honestly, I don't know if I can do this anymore. The last time I trusted my instincts in this field, I lost everything. And today," Victor countered, his voice filled with quiet strength, "your instincts saved everything. Deline, I'm not asking you to be perfect. I'm asking you to do what you did this morning. Pay attention, ask questions, and speak up when something doesn't look right. That's all I need. That's all anyone should need." She was quiet for a long time, her gaze fixed on her hands, her mind wrestling with the weight of her decision. Victor didn't push. He just waited, giving her the space she needed to think, to feel whatever she was feeling. "Can I ask you something?" Deline said finally, breaking the tense silence. "Anything," Victor replied, his voice filled with anticipation. "Why did your wife leave?" The question caught Victor completely off guard. He'd been expecting her to inquire about salary or job responsibilities or hours. Not this deeply personal question, this direct probe into the core of his shattered personal life. "Because I stopped being the person she married," Victor said, his voice laced with a hint of regret. "Honestly, I got so focused on saving the company that I forgot about everything else. A marriage, a daughter, myself. Patricia told me I was drowning, and I was too proud to grab the life preserver. She was right. Do you think she'll come back?" Deline asked, her eyes filled with a strange mixture of curiosity and empathy. Now that things might turn around? Victor thought about Patricia's face in the lobby that morning, the coldness, the finality in her eyes. "No," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. "And maybe that's okay. Maybe some things aren't supposed to be saved. But the company, that's different. That's not just about me. It's about the 200 people who still work for me, the clients who depend on us, the community projects we fund. If I let it die because I was too tired to fight, I'd never forgive myself." Deline nodded slowly, her expression thoughtful. "I understand." "Thank you," Victor said again, his voice filled with gratitude, "for seeing what no one else did." Deline smiled, a genuine smile this time, not the sad, hesitant ones from earlier. "Thank you for listening." Deline nodded once more and walked towards the exit, her silhouette framed against the bright light streaming through the doorway. Victor watched her go, a strange mix of hope and apprehension swirling within him. Then, he looked down at the pen in his hand, the Mont Blanc his father had given him so many years ago. His father had been wrong about one thing. The most important moment in life wasn't when you signed something, committing yourself to a particular course of action. It was when you chose not to, when you defied expectations and forged your own path. He put the pen back in his pocket, a symbolic gesture of defiance, and headed for the elevators, his heart filled with a newfound determination. Tomorrow he would start rebuilding.